In the alternate universe featured in the Fox science fiction series Fringe, it is clear that space travel technology is far more advanced than in our timeline, with daily commercial flights to the moon available to the public, and the Star Wars Orbital Defense Network being deployed. In the last episode, we discussed the possibility of a joint US-Soviet moon landing as proposed by President John F. Kennedy in 1963. Such a venture would lead to unparalleled socio-political and economic benefits for multiple nations, resulting in the more advanced space technology we see in the show. But there still is something else that would be needed to keep the USSR alive into the 21st century.
They would have to basically ease tensions between them and the US, of course, because the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't know if it happened in that timeline. If it did, they would definitely have to have done a lot to fix that, because, well, first of all, if you're going to put nuclear weapons only about 300 miles from a major city in the US, you got a problem. They would have to fix that, and they would have to basically redo their economic system in order to cooperate.
Well, I think if Ronald Reagan ended up in president, I think they would have definitely, he forced the Soviet Union into an arms buildup, arms race that they just couldn't afford, bankrupted them. He also wisely, largely through executive order or through directives that he gave to the CIA, he undermined their. He knew that they were dependent on two resources, and that was oil and natural gas. And through the dossier that he gave to the CIA, they sold faulty parts to the Soviet Union and largely incapacitated their need for natural gas, destroyed large part of their pipeline, and because of that, forced them into big financial problems.
There was never really a time in the history of the Soviet Union where they were economically stable. So if you could have had a time where, let's say, you don't have Stalin and Stalin's purges, and instead you have a real forward-thinking collectivization of farming. One of the traditional problems of the Soviet Union was that they, even as a superpower, really couldn't feed themselves effectively. And you can even go farther back. If if Russia before that had abolished serfdom and replaced it even with peasant labor earlier, then I think the trajectory of the Soviet Union, or Russia and then the Soviet Union, would have been stronger. That said, I'm not sure there would have been so much of a Bolshevik revolution if they'd abolished slavery or abolished serfdom earlier. I think, again, it's kind of an economic discussion. I know one thing for me, if you have a little bit more economic self-sufficiency, starting with the Brezhnev era, you have a little bit more glasnost perestroika like Gorbachev brought in. He was trying to save the Soviet Union, not get rid of the Soviet Union. And if his policies had worked, I really can think of no reason why there wouldn't have been a Soviet Union. I think it would have been a liberalized Soviet Union, much like what we see with China, who still proclaim communism, but also enjoy a good stogie and a ride in a cab and things like that. So.
Yeah. They don't have to go completely capitalist, but they would have to adopt a mixed socialist system.
This also begs the question, if tensions were eased with the Soviet Union earlier in that timeline, what would be the effects upon U.S. relations with China?
It's an interesting historical parallel because our relationship with the Soviet Union started getting better when détente occurred with China. So I can see the same thing happening in reverse. Nixon going to China was part of a grander strategy to help us end our involvement in Vietnam, reduce Chinese support for North Vietnam, and once that warming of relations took place, it worried the Soviet Union. And immediately, Nixon makes a visit to Moscow and begins the APM Treaty, the beginnings of the SALT I agreement. So I can see the same thing happening completely in reverse. I think that for most of the Cold War period, Americans didn't see a difference between Maoism and what essentially was Stalinism. But there were great differences between the two systems, and they actually fought a border war in the 1960s. And we exploited those fears to bring about détente.